Hello and welcome to Gin with Gwynne. I'm Oliver Gwynne, and this is where I give you my off the cuff and unrehearsed thoughts on marketing data. And this week, philosophy, because I'm talking about AI as a form of collective unconsciousness. Now, throughout history, many different philosophers have had some sort of idea of a collective unconsciousness, a shared learning that all of humanity seems to understand without necessarily communicating to each other, despite distances, despite cultural differences, all this kind of thing. There seems to be some sort of background which forms itself in culture, in traditions, in archetypes that we see repeated throughout the world. And most interestingly, at times where we were not particularly connected. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look at AI as the next form of this shared understanding and this shared knowledge for humanity. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at different philosophers and what they sort of said about this subject and then see how that applies to AI. Now, the first philosopher on our tour is Hegel. He had this concept of the world spirit and a historical consciousness. His quote is that the history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom. So he sort of envisioned that human history is a self unfolding geist or spirit, a world mind that becomes sort of aware of itself through the dialectical process of history. So for Hegel, society wasn't just like individuals, but a collective becoming a shared movement towards sort of greater freedom and self awareness. He sort of envisioned that the more that we know about history and as history unfolds and as we as humanity learn, and he had a lot of concepts that were like, it takes three actions to get to the right conclusion on most things. He thought that as history happened and as we had more data to kind of work on, that we would evolve into something better and we would inevitably reach some sort of enlightenment there. So, in today's terms, we might see AI sort of separate from us, but it could be also seen as a new unfolding of this spirit, sort of a technical crystallization of humanity's thoughts, values, and contradictions. And just as Geist sort of needs time and conflict to evolve, AI kind of reflects the historical consciousness of the internet era, and it's shaped by everything we published and searched and shared online. And so, in its own way, AI is becoming its own little history and its own little understanding. And through correction, it will get smarter and eventually lead to something you would imagine that is a collective whole. And while most people assume that it will do that faster than any humans because of computational power, humans are messy and contradictory, and our brains are much smarter than any computer. Never forget that. And so I think that's an interesting idea as how you might apply sort of Hegel's world spirit to AI, but I'm not sure that it necessarily becomes its own sort of being or its own sort of artificial intelligence where it wakes up one day and it knows all of humanity and where we're going to go and it's wiser than us necessarily. I imagine it's just a different form of that sort of collective learning. Because if we're sure of anything, and it seems to be the case very much at the moment, is that we are doomed to repeat history if we don't learn from it. The next philosopher that I wanted to talk about was Jung. He had this concept of collective unconsciousness, so like a vast inherited reservoir of psychological patterns and archetypes that are shared by all humans. These archetypes could be things like the hero, the shadow, the mother, and he posited that they sort of emerge across all myths, dreams, and stories, and that suggested some sort of deep psychic structure beneath the individual minds. He wrote, the collective unconsciousness contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution. In many ways, we could think of this as AI models are trained on the entire internet as they begin to way to resemble this sort of unconscious structure. They don't just mirror the surface level preferences, they tap into deeper patterns and themes and motives that are encoded in our collective output. But unlike sort of Jung's vision there, which was sort of mysterious and sort of self-hearing, the patterns, AI doesn't necessarily understand the patterns that it sees. It only gives you sort of an uncanny simulation of a a collective unconsciousness, it's sort of powerful, but it's kind of hollow. We all know that if you say, "Hey, AI, you're wrong about this," it will believe us. It doesn't quite stand up to scrutiny. And it doesn't tell us that this is true and this is not necessarily true when probed today. But I also think with Jung, it kind of ties into evolutionary psychology a little bit. And I think maybe evolutionary psychology is where I would stand on this. And instead of there being these archetypes that are passed down to us by some sort of psychic residue or something, I think when you look at a lot of behavior, it is inherited just biologically through history. So I saw this study recently where kids were shown, and they were very small kids, like 1 and 2 years old. They were shown an animation of like a hill, and there were two characters. One of the characters helped the other one get to the top of the hill, and the other one pushed the other one down. And at the end of the study, they were asked, "Hey, which of these characters do you like?" And they all pretty much picked the one that helped the other character, and very few of them picked the character that pushed the other one down, even though a lot of them found it quite funny when they looked at the footage. And I find that very interesting because those kids were too young, basically, to have been taught like what's good behavior, what's bad behavior. That was kind of the point of the study, and it showed that there's something inherently born into us, and it could be just biologically or socially as animals. We're taught to sort of go towards this herd behavior and help society and help the herd and all that kind of stuff. But there's something there inherently in us that preferences good people to bad people. Um, and so I think that that might tie more into sort of evolutionary psychology than this idea that Jung had, which is sort of this collective unconsciousness of ideas. But certainly it is interesting how certain ideas are repeated throughout the world, and they're very, very close to each other despite historical sort of distances between them. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about R.D. Lang and the divided self and social reality. So, I guess tying into my last point there, R.D. Lang explored how modern individuals are shaped and often fragmented by the expectations and contradictions of societies that they inhabited. Um, it's very difficult. I think we're all aware of the fact that it's very difficult to pluck something out without it reflecting the wider world that it inherited. And this is a problem that a lot of data people have. They're looking at one particular number and trying to determine the truth of that. But inevitably, every number and every action is part of a wider ecosystem and uh, very much a model of its time and the culture and everything around it. And it's very difficult to unpick that. And large companies perhaps have the guilt that they try and unpick the entire culture instead of just trying to find what's the most useful way of unpicking that one sort of action there. So, in R.D. Lang's The Divided Self, he argued that the experience of being in a world constructed by others can itself be maddening. His work pointed to the alienation caused by collective reality that is performative, surveilled, and often incoherent. This becomes startlingly relevant to the age of AI and social media, where curated personas, algorithmic echo chambers, and feedback loops create a kind of digitally imposed mass self. AI trained on these filtered realities further entrenches them, learning from our performance rather than our essence and feeding it back to us, but optimized. Now, I don't actually believe in this idea of echo chambers. So there's a lot of studies that have been done on this. There was a big worry that basically, if you like left-wing media or right-wing media, you're just going to only see that on your feed, and it will feed back to you what you already think, and it will be very hard to then change people's opinions and views, and we will get a greater divide, which is what it seems like on the internet. But it's kind of been proven by a lot of studies to not be true. It's proven that actually when you are on the internet and on stream, you're quite likely to encounter left wing and right wing. There isn't so much of a personalization towards people to an nth degree level. You will see things that are similar or things, but it's not necessarily that they will reflect the exact viewpoint that you might have. It's not uncommon to challenge these different things. But what social media is trying to do is, of course, get more time from you because then they can serve you more ads, make more money. And so they want to stir up arguments and debates. And what they think is sort of healthy and interesting is to get comments and interaction on their platforms. And so they are trying to stir up that. And maybe what we actually need to do there is to go back to a simpler form of the internet that we had before sort of social media, where there are lots of different little sites that you go for different sources of information, where they are better curated because Facebook at this moment in time has decided they're not going to check anything or fact check anything. And so maybe the thing that we need to do is go to smaller sources of information and not try and put everything into these black boxes that just absorb everything, because inevitably, the more that you absorb into sort of this collective unconsciousness, the harder it is to unpick what is useful and what is not useful, because inherently we are born of the systems that we have created. And similarly, that is very true of AI. So, AI is only relevant of the last sort of 20 years of internet. It can only learn what we put on there digitally. And while you could argue that a lot of humanity's history is now online, it's not necessarily 100% true. You can't really teach AI what was it like to live in the 90s. There's evidence of that. But the evidence is the outcome. It's not necessarily the true life opinion of what people were living at that time. And so I think, yes, AI is another thing that is born of the system that it's made. It is only as good and useful as the data that it inherited. And while it represents sort of a new cultural um, collective knowledge, it is still not really any further than the internet in terms of it's only as useful as what is optimized and what it chooses to give you in terms of an answer. Last but not least, and perhaps the most relevant to this topic, Deleuze and Guattari, and almost, why does nobody have an easy name? Every week I feel like I'm screwing up somebody's name. They had a concept called the machinic unconsciousness and desiring machines. So in their book Anti-Opodus, they propose the concept of the machinic unconsciousness, a system where desire is not lack. Lack is sort of the lack of things, a desire for things that you don't have, as Freud suggested. But production. For them, the unconsciousness is not structured like language or ruled by family drama, but operates more like a factory, endlessly producing flows of desire, connections, breakdowns, and reconfiguration. So they said that desire is a machine, and the object of desire is another machine connected to it, they wrote. In their view, humans and machines are already entangled in co-productive systems. AI becomes in this light not a separate intelligence, but a new assemblage within the machinic unconsciousness, an extension of our desiring system that feeds back into them. Trained on the flows of digital desire, clicks, likes, stories, images, AI replicates and amplifies them, forming a hyperreal unconscious that is both driven by and driven to drive us. So, unlike Jung's architectural depths, this machinic unconsciousness is surface level, recursive, and dangerously scalable. And I think that's very true. And I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that AI is very much a mirror. I don't think it's necessarily a true mirror to us at the moment. It's only reflective of trends, and trends on the internet move really fast. And so it's always going to be changing and evolving. But it's only surface level, really. It doesn't get deeper than what you put into it. And ultimately, all AI is formed on internet searches. Internet searches, they are not perfect, as we all know. They are very much swayed by who's willing to pay them the most money. It's very, very difficult when you stop and think about, well, what information should we be preferencing? Because ultimately, what you have to then do is curate the internet, which is what algorithms do. But that's very difficult, because do you go with somebody who is very knowledgeable, maybe somebody very academic, they know how things work on an academic level and they can spiel that information to you? Or do you go with somebody who can take that academic and apply it literally, but maybe they're not very good at explaining things? Do you go by what's popular, because what's popular must be the most useful to most people? If that's the aim of a publication, is to be useful, do you go by popularity? But ultimately, things that are popular tend to be red top in nature. They tend to have, big headlines and interesting pictures, and that doesn't necessarily reflect how useful they are. So any algorithm is very, very difficult to find what is the most useful, and that's very much true of AI. Although it tries to do that, and it tries to feed that back to us. And so, do I think that AI is going to become either a separate consciousness? Probably not, because there's not enough data that's being fed into it, even though it's got all of the internet on there. It won't reach that next level because it can't understand the context of what it's talking about, and it's too easily fooled today. Um, that black box, people say 5, 10, 20 years. I think it's a lot further than that, because the internet is absolutely nowhere near that, and it's already had 20 years head start. Do I think that AI is going to become a new sort of unconscious that will feed back to us what we're thinking and feeling and all of that kind of thing, and the answers will be reflected, and it's not really being catalogued at this moment, so we can't tell that, hey, ChatGPT told me this at this point and now it's telling me this and this reflects this particular change, where on the internet you can kind of do that to a degree. Nobody's really done it in any way, shape, or form, but it's certainly possible. You can look at the trends over time. Nobody's doing that with AI, and that's probably the thing that we need to start doing. But does that reflect a mass subconsciousness? Yes, but only in terms of internet searches and only in terms of feeding back media. And that feedback loop has got a lot shorter. And so I think it's very much short termism and not necessarily longer approach from that. And so I don't really believe that AI is going to become this sort of representation of mass subconsciousness of what we're all thinking and feeling and its own sort of animal. I do think that it's a little bit separate and it's a little bit surface difference. Um, do I think that there is a mass subconsciousness? I think it largely ties into evolutionary psychology. I don't think that there's a lot of things that we all know and feel because people's experiences are so different and so personalized, and they're all wired through our brains in different ways and different chemical makeups and affected by what food we have and what time of day we're doing things and all this kind of stuff. And so I don't believe in sort of a mass subconsciousness that we all share. I think that a lot of the things that we all associate with are down to evolutionary things and being animals and having some sort of evolutionary where we're prone to think and feel the same things because of that. So those would be my top level thoughts about AI and does it represent this sort of new mass unconsciousness? And my point is, I think it does, but only at a very surface level. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below and tune in next week for some more Gin with Gwynne.